So if you Thank you, Parker, for getting us started with that. You will have an opportunity to view and listen to this recording on the website after the fact, and we can also pass it along for any folks that weren't able to join us today. So we have developed this meeting agenda, and I'll lead us first through introductions. Representing the Montana Department of Transportation is Jacqueline Smith, pre-construction engineer for the Missoula District. And we'll be hearing from Jacqueline about why MDT elected to pursue a study of the Ninepipe corridor. Also from MDT, we have Vicki Cernich, and Vicki is stepping in as MDT's project manager. She works in the Rail Transit and Planning Division, and she'll be talking with us about what is involved in the feasibility study process. And I mentioned that she's stepping in as PM. That's a transition. So Parker Osterla has been serving as PM, so also works in the Rail Transit and Planning Division. My name is Sarah Nicolai, and I'm a transportation engineer with the consulting firm Robert Petch and Associates. And we were hired by MDT to develop this feasibility study. And I'll be facilitating today's meeting. And with me is Scott Randall, who is managing the study for our PA. And Scott will present some of the findings from our initial investigations in the corridor. So as we move through the rest of the agenda for today's meeting, we'll start out with a brief history of the study area and then provide some background on the purpose of the study and the steps that are involved. Then we'll go over the analysis of relevant conditions that was completed late last year, and we want to share some of our findings with you today. We'll also talk about next steps in the study process and explain how you can stay involved. We'll save some time at the end for an open discussion period where you'll be able to type your questions and comments. So before we get started, I did want to touch on a few housekeeping items. As I mentioned, we'll be addressing all of your questions and comments at the end of the brief presentation. But in the meantime, if you have questions and comments that come up, please feel free to type those into the chat box on your screen. You should see an icon on your screen that looks like the one here on ours that says chat. And if you click on it, the chat box will pop up and you can type your question. After the presentation, we'll read each of those questions and comments, and our team will be providing responses. If for some reason you're unable to type or you're having trouble with the chat function, I'll also provide contact information at the end where you can submit your comment and question after the meeting. So with that, I'm going to be turning off my video for a bit, and I'm going to hand it over to Jacqueline to talk about why MDT is pursuing this study, and she'll also provide some background on past efforts in the corridor. So Jacqueline.
Thank you, Sarah. Improvements to the Ninepipe segment of the US 93 corridor have been discussed for some time now, with planning efforts dating back to 1996, when Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, was completed for US 93 between Evero and Polson. For the segment between Post Creek Hill and Ronan, which includes the Ninepipe corridor, the record of decision, or what's known as the decision document, deferred the determination of specific design details. So in 2008, a supplemental environmental impact statement, or SEIS, was completed to identify the design details. Sorry about that. We will be referencing this 2008 SEIS in this presentation today. Since completion of these previous efforts, MDT has continued to develop projects for the segments of US 93 adjacent to the Ninepipe corridor, including Post Creek Hill and Ronan Urban, which was split into two projects, Ronan North and Ronan Urban. Design for the Ronan North segment is complete, and a virtual public open house was recently held in November of 2021. MDT is currently working on right-of-way acquisition, permitting, and utility and maintenance agreements. Construction for Ronan North is planned to start in late 2022 or early 2023, with the exact timing dependent on the completion of the tasks I just mentioned. Design is ongoing for Post Creek Hill, and MDT will continue the public outreach efforts as the design progresses. When developing these projects, MDT has encountered a number of unexpected challenges related to constructability, impacts, and costs. I'm sure as you hear that, none of you are surprised if you're familiar with this area. It is a very complex area. One example includes the groundwater challenges that are making it difficult to design the bridge in the Post Creek Hill area. For the Ninepipe segment, MDT is applying some of these lessons learned from the previous projects and applying them to potential constraints for this Ninepipe project and verifying the overall viability before formal project is nominated for the Ninepipe section. Thank you, Parker. During previous environmental studies, a range of corridor alternatives were considered with various lane configurations. For the Ninepipe corridor, the SEIS identified a preferred alternative that consists of a 2-lane roadway with 1 lane in each direction, widened shoulders, wildlife crossing structures, and a separated shared use path. The preferred alternative was identified based on its ability to best meet the purpose and need for the project to improve highway safety and operations, minimize costs, and minimize impacts to the sensitive resources, including wetlands and wildlife in the area. This is a starting point that we're using for the feasibility study. We don't want to go back and recreate all this important information that's been previously discussed thoroughly. Our focus is to determine if the preferred alternative is feasible to construct and still make sense for this corridor. Next, I'm going to turn this over to Vicki, who will talk in more detail about the feasibility study process.
Thank you, Jacqueline. For this feasibility study, we'll be focusing primarily on whether the preferred alternative from the 2008 SEIS still makes sense, given the updated information and the lessons learned. So with this process, we're verifying the baseline conditions and identifying what has changed and what new information has become available since 2008. We're only looking at relevant conditions, meaning that we're focusing on those elements we think would affect the development of the preferred alternative in a substantial way as it relates to impacts and the costs and construction. So we're relying on both the existing information and additional data, including some updated field investigations. So this information will help us determine if the preferred alternative defined in the 2008 SEIS is feasible to implement, or if minor modifications could be incorporated to minimize impacts and costs. Ultimately, the outcome of the study is going to assist MDT in project development decisions, which will support future environmental documentation for the Ninepipe segment, which will be needed to comply with both state and federal regulations. And with that, Scott's going to talk about some findings from the relevant conditions analysis.
Yeah, thank you, Vicki. So as you mentioned, we've been working to investigate relevant conditions in the study area and to identify any changes that occurred again since 2008. That environmental study was complete, which is now 14 years old. So this evaluation included an analysis of current traffic and safety conditions on the corridor, a primary factor for why improvements are needed. So traffic volumes today range from about 7,000 to 8,500 vehicles per day and are continuing to grow along the corridor. We found that the corridor generally operates at what we call a level of service D. This term level of service refers to the quality of motor vehicle traffic operations on the roadway, and is similar to like a grade you would receive in school, with levels ranging from an A, which represents the best conditions, all the way down to an F, which would represent failing conditions. So for this corridor, level service B generally means that the roadway users are more likely to follow other vehicles, experience more impacts from other vehicles in the traffic stream, and would generally have limited passing opportunities. So the target for a facility of this type would be a level service B, although there may be some exceptions specific to this corridor in an effort to balance, the traffic operations and also negative impacts that come with making improvements. So for future conditions, we also looked at, what's going to happen out into the future under a couple different growth scenarios, and found that the corridor is either projected to remain as it functions similar to as it functions today with a level service D, or if growth experiences a little higher than anticipated, drop down to a level service E. Another important note is the lack of adequate accommodations for non-motorized users. There are currently no dedicated pedestrian bike facilities. The high travel speeds and high traffic volumes on the corridor generally make it not desirable for non-motorized travel. We also looked at updated crash data from the past 5 years, and what we found is that there were 84 total crashes that occurred during this period, or about 17 per year over this about 4.5 mile long segment. Of these crashes, 28, or about a third, involved a wild animal. There were also 13 crashes of rear ends, and 5 crashes ended up being what we call severe crashes, which resulted in either fatality or serious injury. And in total, out of those 5 crashes, there were 4 serious injuries and 3 fatalities that occurred. Next, I want to discuss the land use surrounding the corridor, since we know this is such an important and sensitive area. Most of the study corridor is surrounded by public lands that are managed for wildlife conservation, which are shown in green here on the figure. Additionally, there are some private lands, which are shown in light gray. For the highway improvements, the 2008 SEIS specified a minimum desirable right-of-way width of 160 feet in order to accommodate a 2-lane roadway, widened shoulders, and separated pedestrian and bicycle path. In general, MDT owns this minimum right-of-way width throughout the corridor, although there are some areas, as noted on this figure, that are a bit narrower, including south of Eagle Pass Trail, adjacent to the Ninepipe Lodge, north of Eagle Pass Trail, and just south of Brook Lane, where we have less than that desirable 160 feet of right-of-way. For the study, we also completed an updated evaluation of floodplains within the study area and found that the highway passes through the floodplains associated with the Ninepipe Reservoir and the Crow Creek areas, as indicated in light blue on the figure. We also completed an updated inventory of wetlands and soils within the study area. Overall, there were only minor changes to the information that was developed in 2008. And although the study did identify fairly soft soils and some concerns with soils in the area, there's no evidence of what we call artesian conditions, which means pressurized water underneath the surface, which was found in some of the other nearby areas, which was a big concern. So in general, for this corridor, this is generally good news in terms of construction feasibility moving forward. Additionally, the study included an evaluation of wildlife, which we know is an issue that is very important to the tribes and to the public. The Ninepipe area supports a large variety of species due to the diversity of habitats. And in coordination with resource agencies, the study evaluated wildlife presence in the corridor, habitat connectivity, and instances of injury or mortality related to vehicle conflicts. So we also studied wildlife use of crossing structures similar to the ones proposed for this corridor that were recommended at the Ninepipe Reservoir, the 2 kettle ponds adjacent to the corridor, and the Crow Creek area, which are shown in dark blue on the map here. We are evaluating if these crossings still make sense today and if they will accommodate the species of greatest concern in the corridor. These include grizzly bears and other large mammals such as deer and elk, and also birds and turtles and other wildlife that occur in the area. So we are continuing to coordinate with the tribes and other state and federal resource agencies to discuss how corridor improvements could affect wildlife. Lastly, our team evaluated culturally significant features and sites within the corridor to understand how these may be affected by potential future improvements to the corridor. So the 2008 SEIS identified 3 cultural resources, including the Flathead Indian Irrigation Project, historical stagecoach route, and the Ninepipe cultural property. The Flathead Indian Irrigation Project is a large system with over 1,300 miles of canals. The highway crosses or parallels some of these canals within our area. The historic stagecoach route roughly follows the highway corridor through the Mission Valley. The route is visible as a dirt road following the southwest edge of the Ninepipe Reservoir before crossing the highway and continuing to the northeast. The Ninepipe cultural site includes areas surrounding the entire Ninepipe segment, is documented as a traditional cultural property due to its unique qualities as an environmentally rich area of kettle lakes and glacier wetlands and geological history. The CSKT greatly valued the Ninepipe area, and this property reflects its cultural significance to the tribe. MDT is in the process of conducting government-to-government consultation with the tribes regarding cultural resources. So we're planning to do some field tours when the weather warms up in the springtime to meet with CSKT Preservation Office and cultural committees to discuss cultural resources in the corridor. So this is an ongoing effort. And that brings us to the end of our overview of relevant conditions. So I'm going to head it back, toss it back over to Sarah here.
Thanks, Scott. So I'll turn to next steps in the study. And in terms of our next steps, we'll be completing a feasibility evaluation using information gathered during the relevant conditions analysis that Scott just reviewed for us. So we'll be analyzing the alignment identified for that 2008 preferred alternative, and we'll be defining the approximate construction limits in order to determine anticipated project impacts and costs. We'll also look at an alignment for the separated pedestrian and bicycle path, since the SEIS gave limited information about its location. We'll be looking at which side of the roadway makes the most sense to accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists while also minimizing impacts to important resources. And as Vicki mentioned earlier, we'll also consider other minor modifications if we can find ways to minimize impacts or costs. So as we advance through the study process, we really encourage you to stay involved with us. The next public outreach will occur sometime in the late spring or early summer of this year, and we'll host another virtual meeting focused on the results of our feasibility evaluation. And we hope you can join us again at that time. So with that, we'll turn now to your questions and comments. And as I mentioned before, please feel free to type your questions or comments in the chat box on your screen. So you should see a little icon that looks like this at the bottom. And if you click on that, it should pop up and allow you to type in your question. And I will be reading each one of those questions, and then our team will be ready to respond and address. So please do feel free to type in your question and let us know your thoughts about the study. So far, looks like we have our first question here. So I'll read this out and then our team will be ready to respond. First question, what is the ballpark budget for the project and does it qualify for recent federal infrastructure support? So that's a great question. This is from Robert Cheney. So mainly asking about the cost and qualifying for recent federal infrastructure support. And I'm not sure, Jacqueline, if you'd like to take the first response at this one.
Yes, I can do that. Now I'll get my camera on. Thank you, Robert, for that question. At this point, we don't have all the design details figured out, so it makes it really hard to come up with what the cost estimate for the project is. So we can come up with a general idea based on other projects, but it's not very accurate at all. We need to get further along with figuring out the design elements before we can come up with a cost estimate. As far as federal aid, yes, this project, once it is an actual design project, will be eligible for federal aid. The challenge is that in Montana and I think across the nation, the needs continue to far exceed the funding, even with this new infrastructure bill. So it is going to be just a challenge yet to find a hole to fund this, because we do know, even without it designed, that it is going to be an expensive project. Is there a follow-up question regarding that?
I might just mention real quick to Jacqueline, to build off of that, that while we don't know the cost yet, we have not done any cost estimating yet, we do plan to do some of that later on in the process. So right now we're kind of in our investigation mode, trying to understand what the needs are. And the next step will be the feasibility piece, where we will understand more about the cost estimating for this project.
Thank you, Jacqueline and Scott. Appreciate that. We do have a question that was typed into the question and answer box. So this is from Kevin Davis. And Kevin is asking, I'm curious to know what advocacy groups are working with MDT on this project, as I'm finding in Missoula that advocacy is key for prioritizing projects and funding. So maybe I'll turn to either Scott or Jacqueline for this one as well.
Sorry, getting to my mute button. At this point, we're we're just collecting data, and we are working with CSKT, and CSKT is also looking into other funding sources as well. So just because we're not actively working with anybody right now doesn't mean that we wouldn't be interested in doing that in the future. But at this time, we don't have any advocacy groups that we are working directly with.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And I will just add to that for this response to Kevin. We do have kind of a master contact list that we are building for this study. And in addition to contacts from the tribes, as Jacqueline mentioned, we also have been in coordination with quite a number of resource agencies. So the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, and then numerous departments within the CSKT tribes. And so those folks are very involved in the study. We also have reached out to adjacent landowners, both to gain entry as we were conducting some field analysis, but also to ask their opinions and for their comments about the study. So all of those adjacent landowners are participating. And then we're building a stakeholder contact list. And right now it's a little bit short, but we are hoping to add to that both through these virtual outreach opportunities and then just getting the word out. So Kevin, hope that answers your question. We've got a couple more questions that have been typed into the chat, so I'll move to the next one. This is from Alan Watson asking, if you're likely to create new demand for non-motorized access, are we thinking more parking is likely? How will you weigh impacts on aesthetics? And I might turn to Scott for this one.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and good question. And so I guess a couple of thoughts on this one. So, we do have the recommendation from the SEIS to add the shared use path adjacent to the roadway. And so that's something we are continuing to carry forward. As far as what that means on parking needs and some of those other details, we don't know at this time. And I don't think with this feasibility study that we would get to that point of knowing exactly if we need some of those design details like parking areas or the like. But I do think that general need or general understanding of usage is what we're trying to identify. And then if this does move forward into an actual full design project, which would be the next step, those details would kind of get hammered out during that process. As far as aesthetics go, again, we're relying on the past work that was done in the SEIS that really balanced the need for improvements for safety and traffic, while minimizing impacts to the environment, and that includes the aesthetics as well. And so understanding that we can't, or don't want to go through this area and add a bunch of travel lanes and a bunch of impacts to address maybe just our traffic concern, while negatively impacting those environmental concerns like aesthetics and wetlands and wildlife and all those other things too. So we are trying to kind of balance all the needs as best as we can, and are really relying on a lot of that past documentation and work that has been done and updating it to newer conditions.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for that question, Alan. So next up, we have Bernie asking, is the preferred alternative you're referring to is the one articulated in the 2008 SEIS? Just want to make sure. And Bernie, you're exactly right. So we are referring to what was determined to be preferred back in that 2008 environmental document. That's our starting point and our baseline for this feasibility study. So next we have some questions from Dan saying, your supplemental EIS was done in 2008, 14 years ago. Is it still valid? Everything north of this project is 4-lane. The traffic flow from spring till mid-fall is such that you cannot make a left turn onto the highway. Why not 4-lane in this section? If not 4-lane, it will handle the traffic as soon as it is done. Isn't this about the safety of the people? So really good questions, Dan. And you're exactly right that SEIS was done in 2008. It has been a long time since that was completed. And so that is why MDT is using that information as a starting point, but reevaluating a couple of those key elements, what we're calling relevant conditions. So we are gathering new information for elements that would affect the viability or feasibility moving forward for a project. And as far as the 4-lane determination, I think at that time in 2008, the tribes in coordination with MDT had determined that this segment should stay as a 2-lane undivided roadway because there are so many sensitive resources, a lot of glacial potholes and wetlands and wildlife activity in this segment. So at that time, it was decided to keep it as a 2-lane roadway. But I'll ask either Scott or Jacqueline to jump in with any additional responses to those questions.
Yeah, I think what you said is good, Sarah. I would just add, again, this segment is extremely environmentally sensitive, and so we're trying to balance all those needs and impacts. We do know that safety and is paramount and the biggest concern we have, certainly. Accommodating traffic volumes, is important as well. But again, we're trying to really balance those needs and those challenges, recognizing that this is one piece of Highway 93, and we're trying to make, look big picture and focus on the entire corridor for, how the other segments function with this one and what the needs are and where we can make those improvements to accommodate traffic volumes and where we need to make sure we're being very sensitive to the environment.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Dan, for those questions. Next up, we have Joe asking if there's any special consideration to the access to Fort Kona turnoff. And Scott, I'll ask you to speak to that.
Yeah, not at this point. We have not identified any additional needs for accommodations for turn bays or anything from that standpoint. There is, I see looking ahead, the next comment is about Eagle Pass. There is a safety improvement that is underway. That is a separate project. It's a standalone project, and that will be adding turn bays at the intersection with Eagle Pass Trail. So other than that one, we have not identified any need for additional turn bay accommodations at this time.
Thanks, Scott. And sounds like we've answered then Ed's comment as well about the Eagle Pass project. Dan has a follow-up question to his earlier questions. What will it take to consider a 4-lane road? And I'll turn that one to Scott and Jacqueline as well.
Yeah, I might get Jacqueline's input on this one, I guess. I think from a high level, again, we're working off the past decision that was made, and we have not identified, I guess, justification to change that past decision. That is the environmental document that's out there right now, and so it's what we're working off of. So there'd have to be a major change in conditions to go against that, and some additional information, and I guess working with the tribe and understanding if that's the priority and the need. Maybe Jacqueline can build off that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. That's you definitely covered that well. We do have these previous environmental documents that have looked at this area, and it included looking at traffic, and also a lot of public outreach and stakeholder outreach was huge. So the big part of this study that we're doing is to verify feasibility, and that is to make sure that what was identified in the SEIS is still applicable and will still meet the demands while balancing the impacts to the area. And this project area, more so probably than any other project area, we're being very cautious and careful with the impacts to the area. There's just so many different constraints that are really dictating and limiting what we can do for this segment. So there's more conversation to come, and we will continue to reach out with the stakeholders. But if there is a major change that comes up during this feasibility study, we can carry that conversation forward more. However, if it doesn't really seem that there's a need for it, there would need to be a lot more conversation to consider the 4-lane.
Thank you, Jacqueline and Scott. So next up, we have a question that was typed in the Q&A box from Joe. Do you have any idea of how the Ninepipes Lodge and Museum will be affected in terms of turn lanes and pathway? And I'll turn to Scott for that answer.
Yeah, thanks. And I moved to the slide that kind of shows our land use and existing right-of-way. That is an area right there at the lodge where we do have a narrower existing right of way for the highway. And so we're kind of still trying to figure out what that looks like. Joe, it's a really good question. So we're starting to look at a preliminary kind of alignments and some consideration of what that road and pathway would look like and how that would fit within existing right of way or what additional right of way would be needed. So I don't have a great answer to that yet today. I think at our next meeting later in the spring or summer, we'll have a little more of an idea of kind of those impacts or constraints and what the configuration might look like. But we do know that is kind of a constrained area, and so we're trying to work within those constraints, just like we are with a lot of the environmental areas as well.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Joe, for that question. Looks like Dan has a follow-up. So this was following up from what will it take to consider a 4-lane road. Dan's follow-up comment is there is a need, just ask anyone who drives this road. So Dan, thanks very much for typing in that comment. We'll definitely take that into consideration as we move forward with the study.
I would just maybe build on that real quick, Sarah, I guess if I could.
Yeah, of course.
Dan, we certainly, understand your comments and concerns regarding the traffic volumes, and definitely agree that if we were looking at just traffic volumes alone, this does look like there's a need for some expansion and additional lanes to accommodate those volumes. I mentioned we currently operate at that level service D, which is lower than the standard we would like. And obviously, as traffic volumes increase in the future, it's not going to get better. We understand that's a major concern and a challenge. Again, what we're trying to do is just balance if it's realistic to be able to expand without having major environmental consequences of doing that. And again, we're trying to take a big picture look to not just at this 4.5 mile long segments, but how the entire corridor operates too. So even if this segment does not have expanded lanes for that traffic, we do have areas to the north and to the south that'll provide for better passing opportunities than are there today. So kind of taking a big picture look, and also again just really trying to balance these needs. And if we were looking at it in a vacuum, it's just traffic volumes, that's one thing, but the reality is there's a lot more challenges that we're faced with that we have to consider as well.
Thank you, Scott. So it looks like we have another question. This is from Robert asking, where can we download these maps? So Robert, we are recording this presentation. We will be posting the entire presentation to MDT's website. And I think on our final slide, I believe we have that website listed, but I can read it off as well. Yep, there it is. So mdt.mt.gov/pub/involve/US 93 Ninepipe. And Robert, you can find quite a few materials there. It will get this presentation posted right after today's meeting, but there are some additional materials, including our draft relevant conditions report and some accompanying informational sheets that have some of the same information that we've provided today. So encourage you to take a look at that website and check out those materials. And Parker, it looks like has typed the website into the chat as well. So you can just click on that link and access it directly. What other questions does this group have? Anything else that we can answer today?
Sarah, if I may, I'll just go ahead and jump in, kind of piggybacking on the last two questions from Dan and Robert. There is also a function on that website that I just provided the link to provide comments. So your comments here today and any comments submitted through that website will be part of this study record and be taken into consideration.
Thank you, Parker. And I think with our very last slide, we did want to touch on other ways that you can get in contact. So looks like we have addressed all of the questions entered in the chat box so far, but if you weren't able to type in your question or if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out either to Scott or to Vicky, or as Parker mentioned, you're welcome to go onto MDT's website and enter your question into the comment form. So we just really encourage everyone to review that study website. We have a lot of good information there, and I think if you're interested in reading more detail about our findings, you'll find it on the website. So with that, thank you all for your time today. We will be in touch with you again later this year before our next informational meeting. And again, we will post this recording to the website if you'd like to revisit any of our discussion. Thanks again, everyone.